Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When my dad told me he couldn't make it to my high school graduation because of a scheduling conflict, I didn't think much of it until I saw pictures of him cheering at my stepbrother's soccer game on the same day. Now, he's begging to make amends, but I don't think I can ever forgive him. Graduation day was a big deal for me. It wasn't just about the ceremony itself, but what it represented. A culmination of late-night study sessions, part-time shifts at the coffee shop, and a constant juggling act between school and life. I wasn't at the top of my class or anything, but I was proud of what I'd achieved. For someone who'd felt invisible at times growing up, that moment on stage felt like a declaration. I did it. My mom understood how much it meant, which is why she planned a small backyard celebration for later that evening. She wanted me to feel celebrated, even if we weren't a big, fancy party kind of family. My dad, on the other hand, was a question mark. Earlier that week, I'd called him to confirm he'd be at the ceremony. I'd expected a quick, enthusiastic of course. Instead, there was this awkward pause before he said something vague about a scheduling conflict. "I'll do my best," he added, like it was a chore. At first, I brushed it off. Dad had always been busy, especially after he remarried and started juggling life with my stepmom and stepbrother. Still, something about his tone felt off, like he already knew he wouldn't come but didn't want to outright say it. The morning of graduation was a whirlwind. My mom was running around making sure my cap and gown were ready, snapping pictures of me and my little brother in the front yard. I smiled for the photos, but there was this pit in my stomach. I kept hoping my dad would call or text, saying he'd cleared his schedule. But as we drove to the auditorium, my phone stayed silent. Inside the packed auditorium, I scanned the rows of chairs, trying to spot my dad. I told myself he'd probably just be late, maybe stuck in traffic or held up by work. When my name was called, I walked across the stage to shake hands and get my diploma. I didn't even look at the crowd, afraid I'd see an empty seat where he should have been. The applause felt hollow, like something was missing. After the ceremony, I was surrounded by classmates hugging their parents, posing for pictures, and holding bouquets of flowers. My mom was there, of course, beaming with pride and holding a poster she'd made with glittery letters spelling out, "Congrats, my name." My younger brother gave me a fist bump, but I couldn't help looking over their shoulders, scanning the crowd one last time. He wasn't there. That night, after everyone had left the backyard party, I curled up on the couch with my phone. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some emergency that kept him away. But when I opened Facebook, any hope of that was shattered. The first thing I saw was a picture my stepmom had posted. There was my dad, grinning from ear to ear, sitting in the bleachers at my stepbrother's soccer game. He had one arm slung around my stepmom and the other holding a soda, like he didn't have a care in the world. The caption read, "Proud of stepbrother's name and his team for an amazing game." What a day to remember. I stared at the picture for what felt like forever. The caption kept repeating in my head. What a day to remember. For him, it had been a day to remember, but not for me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He hadn't even tried to come. He'd made a choice, and it wasn't me. I felt this wave of anger and sadness rise up all at once. I wanted to call him right then and there, to demand an explanation, to make him understand how much it hurt. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I just sat there, scrolling through more pictures of the game. My stepbrother scored a goal. My dad had gotten it on video. He'd even commented under the post, "Proud dad moment, proud dad moment." That was what I wanted from him, for him to be proud of me, to show up when it mattered. But he wasn't there for my moment. Instead, he was on a soccer field, cheering for someone else. The tears came suddenly, and I didn't bother trying to stop them. My mom found me a little while later, sitting in the dark with my phone in my lap. She didn't ask what was wrong. She must have seen the picture, too. She just sat down beside me and said softly, "I'm sorry, honey." I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he missed my graduation or the fact that he didn't even care enough to hide it. He'd made his choice, and now I had to figure out how to live with it. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let this slide. By the time I saw the Facebook post, I was beyond furious. My dad had not only missed one of the most important milestones of my life, but he also had the audacity to spend the day cheering for my stepbrother without a second thought. The pictures of him beaming from the bleachers were burned into my mind. The contrast between his joy at the soccer game and his absence at my graduation felt like a slap in the face. I knew I had to confront him, but I didn't want to do it in the comments section for the whole world to see. That would only create more drama, and frankly, I didn't want to embarrass myself. So, I decided to call him. I needed to hear his excuse, whatever pathetic reason he'd cooked up for putting my stepbrother's soccer game over me. He answered on the second ring, his voice light and cheerful, as if everything was perfectly normal. "Hey, kiddo," he said, like he hadn't just broken my heart. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Why weren't you at my graduation?" I asked, my voice sharp and trembling. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear his brain scrambling to come up with a response. "Oh," he said finally, his tone shifting to something more guarded. "Listen, I wanted to be there, but it was a really tough day. Your stepbrother's team had a big game. It was the regional championship, and he'd been working so hard. I didn't realize the game was on the same day as your graduation until it was too late." His words felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing this excuse in the mirror. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad, graduation dates don't sneak up on people. They're set months in advance. I told you about mine as soon as I found out, and you said you'd be there." He sighed heavily, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Look, it's not like I did it on purpose," he said, his voice rising defensively. "I wanted to be there for you. But these things happen. You'll have other big days, college graduation, your wedding. But this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for your stepbrother." The words hit me like a brick. "Once in a lifetime?" I repeated, my voice rising. "And my graduation wasn't? Do you even hear yourself right now?" "I'm just saying," he said, exasperated. "You've always been independent. You don't need me to hold your hand for everything. But stepbrother's name, he needs me to show up for him. He's been struggling, and this game was so important to him." His words felt like a dagger. I'd spent my whole life trying to prove I didn't need anyone, trying to be strong and independent, and now he was using that against me. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. Did he really think my feelings didn't matter just because I wasn't falling apart without him? "So what you're saying," I said slowly, my voice trembling with anger, "is that you decided he needed you more, and I was just supposed to deal with it?" "That's not what I'm saying," he said quickly, but his tone gave him away. That was what he was saying. "Well, that's sure as hell how it feels," I snapped. "You made a choice, Dad, and it wasn't me. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to sit through my graduation, looking around for you, thinking maybe you'd walk in late? Do you even care how much that hurt?" He was silent for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to understand. But then he said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." I froze, the phone pressed to my ear. "I'm sorry you feel that way?" It wasn't an apology, it was a dismissal. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry that I had the audacity to be upset about it. "I have to go," I said abruptly, ending the call before he could respond. I threw my phone down on the couch, my chest heaving with a mix of anger and sadness. For the rest of the night, I replayed the conversation in my head, dissecting every word. I'd hoped for an apology, for some sign that he regretted his decision. Instead, he doubled down, defending his choice as if I should just accept it and move on. The worst part was that I couldn't stop myself from thinking about my stepbrother. It wasn't his fault. He hadn't asked my dad to prioritize him over me. But I couldn't help resenting him. He'd gotten the attention I'd been craving, the validation I thought I deserved. It felt like he was the golden child, the one my dad wanted to show up for. The next day, my stepmom sent me a text. "Your dad feels terrible about missing your graduation. He really wants to make it up to you. Can we take you out to dinner this weekend?" I stared at the message, my stomach churning. The idea of sitting across from them, pretending everything was fine, made my skin crawl. I didn't respond. Instead, I let my phone buzz with more texts and calls from my dad, each one more desperate than the last. "Hey, can we talk? I know you're upset, but I'm trying here. I'm sorry, okay? Please don't shut me out." I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't know what to say, or if I even wanted to say anything at all. For years, I tried to convince myself that my dad's absences didn't matter, that I didn't need him to show up for me. But now, I couldn't ignore the truth. I did need him. And when it came down to it, he'd chosen someone else. After that phone call, I decided I was done talking to my dad, at least for a while. Every word he'd said kept replaying in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make it hurt any less. He had chosen someone else over me, plain and simple, and there wasn't an apology in the world that could undo that. So, I stopped answering his texts and let his calls go straight to voicemail. My mom backed me up completely. She'd been furious from the moment she saw that Facebook post. "He had no right to miss your graduation," she said. "None. And you don't owe him a conversation right now. Take all the time you need." For once, I listened to her advice without pushing back, but the time didn't seem to help. The anger didn't fade. It just shifted into a dull ache that sat heavy in my chest. I thought ignoring him would make me feel better, but it didn't. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, I'd feel that familiar surge of frustration and sadness all over again. He didn't seem to understand that this wasn't just about one missed event. It was about what that choice said about me, about where I stood in his life. Then, my stepmom got involved. She sent me a long, overly chipper text a week later, saying my dad feels terrible and really wants to make it up to me. She suggested a belated graduation dinner, saying they'd pull out all the stops to celebrate me properly. It was clear she was trying to smooth things over, but her tone, full of exclamation points and emojis, just made me angrier. The idea of sitting at their dinner table, pretending everything was fine, was unbearable. I could already picture it. My stepbrother talking about his soccer game, my dad trying too hard to make small talk, and my stepmom playing referee. It felt like a setup for more hurt, not healing. So, I ignored her message too. My dad, meanwhile, wasn't giving up. His texts became more frequent, his voicemails more emotional. At first, they were short and casual, like he was trying to ease his way back in. Hey, just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. Call me when you can. But as the days stretched on without a response, his tone changed. His messages grew longer, more frantic. I know I messed up, he said in one voicemail. I was wrong, and I want to fix this. Please, just talk to me. Don't shut me out. Each message felt like a weight pressing down on me. I wanted to believe he meant it, that he really was sorry, but the hurt was too raw. The memory of sitting in that auditorium, scanning the crowd for him, was still fresh in my mind. How could he possibly think a voicemail would make that go away? My mom told me he'd started reaching out to her too. He'd shown up at our house one afternoon when I wasn't home, asking to talk to me. He looked awful, she said, almost like she felt bad for him. But I told him he needs to give you space. He didn't argue, just said he'd keep trying. Hearing that left me conflicted. Part of me wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the resentment that felt like armor. But another part, the part that still wanted my dad to be a real, present father, felt a pang of guilt. Maybe he really was trying. Maybe I was being too hard on him. But then I'd think about what he'd said during our phone call, about how I'd have other big days and how my stepbrother needed him more. That wasn't something I could just forgive and forget. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice, and it said everything about where I stood in his life. The silence between us dragged on for nearly a month. During that time, I kept myself busy with work and friends, trying to distract myself from the gnawing ache in my chest. But no matter how much I tried to push it down, the hurt lingered. Every time I thought about him, it was like reopening the wound all over again. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. At some point, I'd have to decide whether I wanted to confront him again or let the relationship fade entirely. But for now, I wasn't ready. He wanted to talk, to apologize, to fix things. But none of that would matter if he didn't truly understand what he'd done. And I wasn't sure he ever would. Months had passed since my graduation, but the wound still felt fresh. Every time I thought about my dad, a knot tightened in my chest. I couldn't decide which emotion was stronger, anger at his choice, or sadness that he didn't seem to understand how deeply it had hurt me. I was going through the motions of daily life, but the rift with my dad hung over me like a shadow. One weekend, my mom suggested I spend a few days with my Aunt Marcy. She lived a few hours away in a small, quiet town, and visiting her always felt like hitting a reset button. Aunt Marcy had this calming presence. She never pushed, never judged, just listened. I hadn't seen her in a while, and the idea of getting away from everything sounded good. When I arrived at her house, she greeted me with one of her signature hugs, the kind that made you feel like the world could fall apart and she'd still hold you together. After a delicious dinner, we settled onto her porch with mugs of tea. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over her garden, but my mood was anything but sunny. "It's been a rough few months, huh?" she said gently, sensing I needed an opening. I nodded, staring into my tea. You could say that. She didn't press, just waited for me to start talking. And eventually, I did. I told her everything, the missed graduation, the Facebook post, the excuses my dad had given, and the endless voicemails that followed. I laid it all out, venting in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. "I just don't get it," I said, my voice breaking. How could he choose a soccer game over me? How could he think that was okay? Aunt Marcy sighed, her expression thoughtful. "I'm not saying what he did was right, because it wasn't. But your dad isn't perfect. None of us are. Sometimes people make bad choices because they're afraid of letting someone else down. Her words caught me off guard. Afraid of letting someone else down? I repeated, frowning. What about letting me down? Didn't that matter to him? Of course it mattered, she said. But your dad's been juggling a lot. His new family, his relationship with you, trying to make everyone happy. Sometimes, in trying to please one person, we end up hurting someone else. I wanted to argue, to reject her attempt at making sense of his actions. But deep down, I knew there was some truth in what she was saying. My dad wasn't a villain. He was a flawed human being who had made a terrible decision. That didn't make it hurt any less, but it did make me wonder if there was more to his side of the story. The rest of the weekend was peaceful. Aunt Marcy didn't bring up my dad again, but her words stayed with me. As much as I wanted to stay angry, I couldn't ignore the possibility that his choice had come from a place of fear, not malice. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it made me feel like maybe there was a path forward, if I was willing to take it. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something. Ignoring my dad's attempts to reach out had given me space to process, but it hadn't brought me any closer to closure. If anything, it had left me with more questions. I decided to write him a letter. It wasn't about forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that. But I needed to lay everything out in a way I hadn't during our phone call. I needed him to understand exactly how his actions had hurt me and why it wasn't something that could be fixed with a quick apology. Sitting down with a blank piece of paper in front of me, I felt a wave of hesitation. Where did I even begin? How could I condense months of anger and sadness into something coherent? But once I started writing, the words poured out. I wrote about how excited I'd been for graduation, how I'd worked so hard to get to that moment, and how much it meant to me to have my family there. I described the sinking feeling of looking out into the crowd and realizing he wasn't there. I told him about the humiliation of seeing the Facebook post, of knowing he'd chosen a soccer game over me. You didn't just miss an event, I wrote. You missed a milestone, one of the biggest days of my life. And what hurts even more is that you didn't seem to understand why it mattered. You brushed it off, like my feelings weren't important, like I just get over it. But I can't just get over it, Dad. What you did damaged our relationship, and it's going to take more than an apology to fix that. I ended the letter by telling him I wasn't ready to talk face-to-face yet, but I wanted him to really think about what I'd written. I needed him to understand that this wasn't about punishing him. It was about making sure he truly got how much his actions had hurt me. After sealing the letter in an envelope, I stared at it for a long time. Part of me wondered if I was making a mistake, opening the door to a conversation I wasn't sure I was ready to have. But another part of me knew this was the only way to move forward. I dropped the letter in the mailbox the next morning and felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. I didn't know how he'd respond, or if he'd even understand what I was trying to say. But for the first time in months, I felt like I'd taken a step, maybe not toward forgiveness, but toward something. And for now, that was enough. It took 2 weeks for my dad to respond to my letter, and every day that passed felt like an eternity. Part of me wondered if he'd even read it, or if he'd dismissed it as just another emotional outburst from his overly independent daughter. I tried not to think about it too much, but every time I checked the mailbox or opened my email, there was a small flicker of hope that today might be the day. When his reply finally came, it arrived in the form of a thick envelope, not an email or a voicemail like I'd expected. My name was scrawled on the front in his messy handwriting, and for a moment, I just stared at it. I wasn't sure I was ready to read what he had to say, but curiosity got the better of me, and I tore it open. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages long. That, in itself, was surprising. My dad wasn't the kind of person who expressed himself easily, especially not in writing. The fact that he'd taken the time to put pen to paper meant something. I just wasn't sure what yet. The letter started with an apology. I know I've let you down, he wrote. I've been playing this moment over and over in my head, wishing I could go back and make a different choice. I can't tell you how sorry I am for not being there on your graduation day. You deserved better from me, and I failed you. Reading those words felt like a small weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, he wasn't brushing off my feelings or trying to downplay what he'd done. He was owning up to it, and that meant something. But as I kept reading, the letter took a turn I wasn't expecting. My dad admitted that he'd known about the scheduling conflict weeks in advance. He hadn't just realized it last minute, as he'd claimed during our phone call. He'd been sitting on the decision, torn between two choices, and hadn't told me because he didn't know how to face me. I felt trapped, he wrote. I knew how important your graduation was to you, but I also knew how important that game was to Stepbrother's name. He's been struggling since the divorce, feeling like he's always in the background, like he's not as important as everyone else. When he asked me to come to the game, I felt like I had to say yes. He needed me in a way I thought you didn't. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. He thought I didn't need him. He thought my strength, my independence, meant I could handle being let down. And instead of seeing my graduation as a moment where I needed him most, he decided I'd be fine without him. I thought I was doing the right thing, he continued. I thought I was being there for a kid who needed me more. But in trying to support him, I let you down, and that's something I'll always regret. I hope you can forgive me someday. I set the letter down and stared at it, my emotions a tangled mess. I felt anger at his decision, sadness at the reasoning behind it, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny sliver of pity. I could tell he was genuinely sorry, but his apology didn't erase the hurt. If anything, it deepened it. It was like he'd made me a victim of my own strength. My whole life, I'd been told I was the resilient one, the one who could handle whatever came her way. But that strength had become an excuse for him to put me second. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't okay. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about his letter. Part of me wanted to rip it to shreds, to throw it in the trash and let my silence speak for itself. But another part of me, the part that still cared, despite everything, felt a glimmer of understanding. I thought about my stepbrother and how he must have felt when he asked my dad to come to his game. The divorce had hit him hard, harder than I'd realized. And unlike me, he didn't have a strong support system outside of our dad. Maybe he really did need that moment more than I could understand. But even if that were true, it didn't make my dad's choice any less hurtful. He could have been honest with me from the beginning instead of hiding the conflict. He could have tried to split his time or find a way to be there for both of us. But he hadn't. He'd taken the easy way out, and I was the one left feeling abandoned. I picked the letter up again and reread the last paragraph. I hope you can forgive me someday, he'd written. He didn't ask for an immediate resolution or try to guilt me into moving on. He seemed to understand that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand. It was something he'd have to earn. Still, I wasn't sure what to do next. Was this enough to start rebuilding our relationship? Could I trust him not to let me down again? Or was this just another empty promise in a long line of disappointments? I decided I needed more time to figure it out. For now, I wasn't ready to reach out. His letter had given me a glimpse into his side of the story, but it didn't fix everything. There was still so much pain, so much doubt, and I wasn't sure I could move forward until I knew he truly understood the depth of what his choice had cost me. As I folded the letter and put it back in its envelope, I felt a strange mix of emotions: confusion, sadness, and maybe a flicker of hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. And for now, that was all I could give. A few weeks after I received my dad's letter, he reached out again, this time with a more direct request: lunch. He said he wanted to talk face to face. No excuses, no interruptions, just the two of us. He promised he wouldn't pressure me into forgiving him, but hoped I'd give him a chance to explain himself fully. I hesitated before agreeing. The idea of sitting across from him, confronting all the emotions I'd been avoiding, wasn't appealing. But part of me knew I needed to see him. I couldn't stay in limbo forever, replaying old arguments in my head and carrying around this weight. So, reluctantly, I agreed. When I arrived at the restaurant, I saw him before he saw me. He was sitting at a corner table, fidgeting with his phone and glancing toward the door every few seconds. He looked small, somehow, like a man who'd been stripped of his usual confidence. When his eyes finally met mine, he smiled nervously and stood up, almost like he wasn't sure if he should hug me or keep his distance. I opted for a quick, polite nod and slid into the seat across from him. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Thanks for coming." I shrugged. Figured it was time to talk. The waitress came by to take our drink orders, giving us a brief reprieve from the awkwardness. As soon as she walked away, my dad launched into an apology, one that felt more genuine than any of his previous attempts. "I know I've said it before, but I need to say it again. I'm so sorry," he began, his voice unsteady. "I let you down in a way I can't take back, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know how much I regret what I did. Not just missing your graduation, but the way I handled everything after. I've been thinking about it nonstop, and I know I have a lot to make up for." I folded my arms, trying to keep my expression neutral. I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. "Why did it take you this long to get it?" I asked. "It's not like this is the first time you've prioritized someone else over me." He flinched at my words, his shoulders slumping. "You're right," he admitted. "It's not. And that's on me. I've spent so much time trying to juggle everything. My job, my marriage, your stepbrother. that I've ended up neglecting the one person who's always been there for me. You. Hearing him acknowledge that was unexpected, and it caught me off guard. For a moment, I thought about lashing out, about listing every instance where I'd felt overlooked or unimportant. But something about the look on his face stopped me. He wasn't just apologizing. He was pleading for a chance to make things right. You made a choice, I said finally, my voice steady but firm. And I need you to understand what that choice said to me. It said I wasn't enough. It said that no matter how much I accomplish or how much I want you there, someone else will always come first. He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've been a coward, he said quietly. I thought I was doing the right thing by trying to be everything for everyone, but all I've done is hurt the people I care about the most. When I chose your stepbrother's game over your graduation, I wasn't just letting you down. I was failing as a father. His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. I wanted to believe him, to accept his apology and start moving forward. But forgiveness wasn't that simple. The rest of the lunch was a careful dance between honesty and restraint. My dad asked questions about my life, how work was going, what my plans were for the future, and I answered cautiously, unsure how much I wanted to share. It felt strange, almost like we were meeting for the first time. At one point, he leaned forward and said, I don't want to just patch things up and go back to the way things were. I want to be better, for you and for myself. I've been seeing a counselor, trying to figure out how to be the dad you deserve. It's a process, but I'm willing to do the work if you'll let me. The mention of counseling surprised me. My dad had never been the type to talk about feelings, let alone seek professional help. It made me wonder if he really was serious about changing. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet, I said honestly. It's going to take time. I understand, he said, nodding. I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. As the meal wound down, the tension between us began to ease, if only slightly. By the time we said goodbye, I felt a small flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could start to rebuild what had been broken. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a long road ahead. The pain of his absence at my graduation, and all the other moments he'd missed, wasn't something I could let go of overnight. And I wasn't sure if he fully understood just how deep those wounds went. For now, though, I'd taken the first step. And while it wasn't forgiveness, it was a beginning. And that felt like enough, for now. I didn't expect much from our second meeting after the awkward lunch. In fact, I only agreed to meet again because my mom convinced me that sometimes, healing is a process, not a single event. You don't have to forgive him all at once, she'd said. But you'll never know if he's serious about changing unless you give him the chance to prove it. So, a week later, I found myself sitting across from my dad in a quiet coffee shop, trying to muster the patience to hear him out. He seemed different this time, not just nervous, but genuinely reflective. He wasn't rushing to fill the silence with apologies or excuses. He just sat there for a moment, staring down at his hands, like he was trying to figure out where to start. Finally, he looked up and said, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the choices I've made and how they've hurt you. And I realized, it's not just about the graduation. It's bigger than that. I raised an eyebrow, not sure where he was going with this. What do you mean? He took a deep breath, his gaze steady but tinged with regret. I've been failing you for a long time, he admitted. Not just that day, but in so many ways. And I've been trying to figure out why I keep messing up, why I can't seem to get it right. And I think I finally understand. That got my attention. For years, I'd been waiting for him to take accountability, to go beyond the surface-level apologies and really dig into the reasons behind his actions. But I wasn't prepared for what he said next. He leaned forward, his voice low and serious. After the divorce, I felt like I'd failed as a dad. Completely failed. I thought I'd ruined everything. Your childhood, your sense of security, your trust in me. And the truth is, I didn't know how to fix it. So, I started second-guessing every decision I made, trying to be everything to everyone. I thought if I could just do enough, if I could be the perfect dad, maybe I could undo some of the damage. I didn't say anything, letting him continue. But instead of fixing things, he said, his voice cracking slightly, I just created more problems. I stretched myself too thin, trying to make everyone happy. And when it came to that day, your graduation, I made a terrible choice because I thought I could make up for something else. He hesitated, as if bracing himself for my reaction, then said, Your stepbrother told me he felt like he'd lost his dad in the divorce. He said he felt like he was always competing with you, like he wasn't enough. I didn't want him to feel like I wasn't there for him, so I made the wrong call. I thought I could fix one thing without realizing I was breaking something else. His words hung in the air, and I wasn't sure how to respond. On one hand, it was the first time I'd heard him admit to something so deeply personal. On the other hand, it didn't change the fact that I was the one left picking up the pieces of his bad decisions. So what? I said finally, my voice sharper than I intended. You decided he needed you more than I did? That I was strong enough to handle it? He nodded slowly. That's exactly what I thought. And I realize now how wrong I was. You've always been strong, stronger than I probably deserve, but that doesn't mean you don't need me. I see that now. I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to figure it out. Hearing him say those words felt complicated. Part of me wanted to cling to my anger, to remind him of all the times his absence had hurt me, not just on graduation day but throughout my life. But another part of me, smaller, quieter, felt a flicker of understanding. He wasn't excusing his actions. He was trying to explain them, and for the first time, it felt like he was being completely honest with me. I don't know if I can just forgive you, I said, my voice softer now. It's not that simple. I don't expect you to, he replied quickly. I know I've lost your trust, and I don't deserve to get it back just because I'm finally being honest. But I want you to know that I'm trying. Not just for you, but for myself. Because I can't keep living with the way I've been letting people down. There was something raw about the way he said it. Something that made me feel like this wasn't just about me anymore. He wasn't trying to win me over with empty promises. He was trying to reckon with his own failures, his own guilt. And that, more than anything, caught me off guard. The conversation ended on a tentative note. He didn't ask me to commit to anything. Not forgiveness, not a specific timeline for rebuilding our relationship. He just said he hoped I'd keep giving him the chance to prove himself. As I drove home, I replayed his words in my head, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. It was still a mess of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. But underneath it all, there was a sliver of something new. Hope. It wasn't much, and it wasn't enough to make me forget all the hurt he'd caused. But it was enough to make me consider the possibility that we could move forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward understanding each other better. After that second conversation with my dad, I felt like I'd reached a crossroads. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of my anger and disappointment, using it as a shield to keep him at arm's length. But now, with his raw admission still fresh in my mind, I had to decide. Was I going to keep holding on to that anger, or was I willing to give him a chance to prove himself? It wasn't an easy choice. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about pretending the hurt didn't happen. It wasn't about letting him off the hook or acting like everything was fine. It was about deciding whether I wanted to rebuild our relationship or let it go completely. And as much as I hated to admit it, the idea of cutting him out of my life entirely felt too final, too empty. I thought about everything he'd said, the guilt he carried, the mistakes he'd made, and his promise to try to be better. For the first time, it felt like he was truly taking responsibility, not just for missing my graduation but for years of neglect. I couldn't ignore that effort, even if it didn't erase the pain. So, after a lot of back and forth in my head, I told him I was willing to give him a chance, but only if he was willing to put in the effort to earn my trust back. When I called to tell him, he sounded almost surprised. "You're really giving me another shot?" he asked, his voice a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Yes," I said firmly, "but I need you to understand something. This isn't about you saying the right things. It's about showing me you mean it. Words are nice, but actions are what matter." "I get it," he said quickly. "I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." It was a promising start, but I wasn't naive enough to think it would be smooth sailing. Rebuilding trust wasn't going to happen overnight, and I needed to see consistent effort, not just an initial burst of enthusiasm that fizzled out after a few weeks. In the months that followed, my dad surprised me. He didn't just make promises, he followed through. He showed up at my college orientation, a gesture that meant more to me than I expected. As I walked around campus, trying to navigate the overwhelming sea of new faces and unfamiliar buildings, I spotted him in the crowd. He wasn't trying to take over or draw attention to himself. He was just there, quietly supporting me. He started sending me texts at unexpected times, simple things like, "Good luck on your exam today. I know you'll do great," or "Thinking of you. Hope your day's going well." They weren't long or overly sentimental, but they were enough to remind me that he was paying attention, that he cared. The biggest change, though, was that he began asking how he could support me better. It wasn't just about what he thought I needed. He wanted to know what I actually needed. "I don't want to assume anymore," He told me during one of our conversations. I want to get it right this time. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when old frustrations bubbled to the surface, moments when I questioned whether he really understood how deep the hurt went. But each time, he handled it with patience, listening instead of getting defensive. One evening, a few months into our renewed efforts, he called me out of the blue. "Hey," he said, his tone hesitant. "I've been thinking about that day, your graduation. I know I've apologized, but I wanted to say it again. I don't think I'll ever stop regretting missing it." I took a deep breath, unsure how to respond. The wound was still there, but hearing him acknowledge it again felt different. Like he wasn't just saying it to appease me, but because he genuinely understood the gravity of what he'd done. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "But I need you to understand something. It's not just about that one day. It's about all the times you made me feel like I didn't matter. This isn't going to be fixed with a few good months. It's going to take time." "I know," he said softly, "and I'm okay with that. I'm in this for the long haul." As the months went by, I started to believe him. He didn't try to rush me or push for forgiveness on his timeline. He let me set the pace, and that made all the difference. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let my guard down. There were small moments that stood out, moments that reminded me of the dad I used to look up to. Like the time he called just to check in after I'd had a rough week, or the day he sent me flowers with a note that said, "Just because I'm proud of you." But it wasn't just the big gestures. It was the consistency, the way he kept showing up, even when it would have been easier to retreat. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he was trying, and that effort was starting to chip away at the walls I'd built around my heart. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't a single moment. It was a series of choices, a willingness to let go of the anger piece by piece. And while I wasn't all the way there yet, I could feel myself moving closer. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were building something real, something that wasn't just about the past but about the future, too. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need. Rebuilding a relationship isn't like flipping a switch. It's more like fixing a cracked vase. Delicate, painstaking work where every new bond feels tentative, like it might shatter under the slightest pressure. That's how it felt with my dad in the months after we started mending things. We weren't back to normal, because normal didn't exist anymore, not after everything that had happened. Instead, we were trying to create something new, something more honest, if not entirely comfortable. I'll admit, I was cautious. Even as my dad made an effort to show up for me in ways he hadn't before, a part of me kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. It wasn't easy to let go of years of disappointment overnight. I think he sensed that hesitation too, because he was careful not to push. Instead of trying to win me over with big, dramatic gestures, he focused on the little things. Checking in regularly, showing genuine interest in my life, and, most importantly, listening. One day, while I was venting to him about a tough class I was taking, he said something that surprised me. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I'm here to help however I can. Even if that just means being someone you can complain to." It was such a simple statement, but it meant a lot. For so long, I'd felt like I had to prove myself to him, to earn his approval. Now, for the first time, it felt like he was trying to meet me where I was instead of expecting me to meet him halfway. As my relationship with my dad began to change, so did my perspective on my stepbrother. For months, I'd held onto this image of him as the antagonist in my story, the golden child who'd stolen my dad's attention. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that wasn't fair. He wasn't the villain. He was just a kid who wanted his dad's love and approval, the same way I did. It started with a simple conversation. I was over at my dad's house one afternoon, and my stepbrother was hanging out in the living room, playing a video game. I hesitated before sitting down on the couch next to him, unsure how to bridge the gap between us. "Hey," I said awkwardly. "What are you playing?" He glanced over at me, surprised. It's a soccer game."
FIFA.
Of course, it was soccer. I almost laughed at the irony, but I bit my tongue and watched as he showed me how to play. We spent the next hour competing against each other, laughing every time one of us made a ridiculous mistake. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. Over time, we started talking more. At first, it was small stuff, school, sports, video games, but eventually, the conversations grew deeper. One day, he opened up about how hard the divorce had been for him. "I felt like everything changed overnight," he said, his voice quiet. "One day, I had this family, and the next, I didn't. And I guess I just started feeling like I wasn't important to anyone anymore." Hearing him say that hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't that I didn't know how tough the divorce had been. It had been hard on all of us, but I'd never stopped to think about how he might have felt. In my own pain, I'd overlooked his. I get it, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. I felt that way, too, sometimes. Like I was always fighting for attention, but no one noticed. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine. I think that's why I asked Dad to come to that game, he admitted. It wasn't about the game, really. It was about knowing he'd show up for me. His honesty left me speechless for a moment. I'd spent so long resenting him for that game, for what it had cost me, but now I realized it wasn't as simple as him taking something away from me. He was just trying to hold on to something for himself. As my stepbrother and I started to build a connection, it had an unexpected ripple effect on my relationship with my dad. I think seeing us talk, laugh, and even bond made him feel like there was hope for our fractured family. It wasn't perfect. We still had our moments of tension and miscommunication, but it was progress. One evening, as we were all sitting around the dinner table, my dad made a toast. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm grateful for the chance to make things right. And I'm proud of both of you for being patient with me and with each other. His words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was fighting for a place at the table. I felt like I belonged. That's not to say everything was magically resolved. There were still moments when old wounds resurfaced, when I found myself questioning whether my dad's efforts were enough. But those moments were fewer and farther between. One day, as I was leaving my dad's house, he stopped me at the door. I know I've said it before, but I want to say it again. Thank you for giving me a second chance. I don't take it for granted. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I believed him. I'm still figuring things out, I admitted. But I'm glad we're trying. It wasn't the picture-perfect resolution I'd once dreamed of. We weren't some flawless, storybook family where everyone knew exactly how to love and support each other. But what we were building felt real, and that was enough. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of our broken relationship alone. We were in this together, learning and growing one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was what family was supposed to be. It had been a little over a year since my graduation, the one my dad missed. A lot had changed in that time. We weren't the same people we'd been then, and our relationship wasn't the same either. Slowly, through effort and patience, we'd built something new. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, I felt like my dad was really trying to show up for me. So when he called one day and told me he was planning a do-over for my graduation, I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me appreciated the gesture, but another part wondered if it was too little, too late. Could a backyard barbecue really make up for everything I'd felt that day? Still, I agreed to go. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the work we put into repairing our relationship and the chance to celebrate how far we'd come. The day of the barbecue, I arrived at my dad's house with a mix of nerves and curiosity. The backyard was simple but welcoming. There were string lights hanging between the trees, a folding table covered in a checkered tablecloth, and a small grill smoking in the corner. My mom was there, chatting with my stepmom like they'd been lifelong friends, which was surprising but also kind of comforting. My stepbrother was setting up a speaker, fiddling with his playlist while pretending not to care too much about getting it right. And then there was my dad, standing near the grill, looking slightly nervous but proud. When he saw me, his face lit up, and he came over with his arms outstretched for a hug. "You made it," he said, squeezing me tightly. Of course, I said, smiling despite myself. I wasn't going to miss my own do-over. As the evening unfolded, I realized how much thought my dad had put into the event. He'd invited not just family but a few close friends, people who had been part of my journey growing up. He even found a way to recreate little details from the original graduation day, like the flowers my mom had given me or the celebratory cake we'd had afterward. At one point, my stepbrother pulled me aside. "You know, he's been planning this for weeks," he said, almost shyly. He really wanted it to be special for you." Hearing that softened something in me. It wasn't about the barbecue or the decorations. It was about the effort. My dad wasn't trying to rewrite the past. He was trying to acknowledge it, to say in his own way, "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry." After everyone had eaten, my dad stood up to give a speech. He clinked his glass with a spoon, waiting for the chatter to die down, and then cleared his throat. "I just want to take a moment to say a few things," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "First, thank you all for being here. Tonight isn't just about celebrating my daughter. It's about celebrating second chances and the people who give them to us." He looked at me then, his eyes earnest. "I know I've said it before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry. Missing your graduation was one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made, and it's something I'll always regret. But what I regret even more is the way I made you feel. Like you didn't matter, like you weren't my priority. You did, and you are. Always. The backyard was quiet, save for the hum of the crickets. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I didn't care. For the first time, I felt like he truly understood, not just the event he missed, but the deeper impact of that choice. He smiled then, a little sheepishly. So, this isn't about making up for what I missed. It's about honoring you, because you deserve to be celebrated, not just for your graduation, but for everything you've accomplished and everything you're going to do. As the night went on, I found myself laughing and talking more than I expected. There was a lightness to the evening, a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. At one point, I caught my dad watching me from across the yard, his expression a mix of pride and something I couldn't quite place. When I walked over to him, he smiled. "I know this doesn't fix everything," he said quietly. "No, it doesn't," I agreed. Then I paused. "But it helps." We stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the party unfold. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And maybe that was enough. In the end, the do-over wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it and choosing to move forward. My dad didn't just make amends that night. He made a promise to be better, not just in words but in actions. And while it wasn't the perfect fairy tale ending, it was real. Sometimes that's all you can ask for.